Have you ever witnessed a strategic move on the world stage that left you utterly captivated by its boldness and the subtle ripple effects it created? For me, a recent development involving China's Liaoning aircraft carrier has done just that. In an unprecedented show of force, the PLA's Liaoning carrier group, an oversized battle group, has sailed beyond the first island chain, pressing close to the heart of the US's second island chain, Guam. Yet, the reaction from the US and Japan has been strikingly subdued. The USS Washington aircraft carrier, after just 10 days out of port, abruptly turned back to its home base in Yokosuka. With an astonishing 816 missile launch cells at its disposal, the Liaoning carrier group, comprising 18 vessels, closed in on Guam. On June 5th, the Japanese Ministry of Defense announced that 4 more Chinese naval vessels had entered the Western Pacific into groups, passing through the Osumi Strait and the Miyako Strait respectively. The Osumi Strait group included the Type 055 large destroyer Lhasa 102 and the Type 054A frigate Weifun. The Miyako Strait group consisted of the Type 054A Yantai and the Type 903A supply ship Kokana Lake. Adding these to the Liaoning carrier group already conducting exercises in the Western Pacific, the Chinese Navy currently has a staggering 16 vessels operating in the region. Beyond mere quantity, the quality of this fleet is exceptionally high. 6 of these vessels boast displacements over 10,000 tons. The aircraft carrier Liaoning, 3 Type 055 large destroyers Nanchang 101, Lhasa 102, and Wuxi 104, and 2 large supply ships Type 901 Hulun Lake and Type 903A Kokana Lake. The remaining 10 vessels, though under 10,000 tons, are by no means insignificant, comprising 5 Type 052D destroyers and 5 Type 054A frigates. This deployment marks an unprecedented new record for the PLA's carrier-borne firepower in the Western Pacific. Just counting missile launching equipment, the surface fleet alone boasts 816 vertical launch system VLS cells. The 3 Type 055 destroyers each have 112 large universal VLS units for both hot and cold launches, totaling 336. The 5 Type 052D destroyers each have 60 for large universal VLS units, totaling 320. The 5 Type 054A frigates each have 30 to smaller VLS units, totaling 160. These 816 VLS cells form one of the largest and most advanced maritime missile arsenals in the world today, capable of flexibly loading and rapidly launching various advanced munitions, including HQ-9B long-range air defense missiles, YJ-18 supersonic anti-ship missiles, YJ-1 hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missiles, and land attack cruise missiles. This is merely the firepower of the surface combatants. The PLA's conventional and nuclear submarines, which are undoubtedly part of the escorting fleet and boast a 5-fold power multiplier, will further enhance the Liaoning carrier group's stealth, strike capability, and anti-access, area denial A2/AD capabilities with their new generation of submarine-launched missiles and torpedoes. This isn't the first time a PLO aircraft carrier has approached Guam. In December 2022, the Liaoning reached within 300 nautical miles of Guam, conducting 3 consecutive days of exercises right under the nose of the US military. At that time, J-15 fighters frequently took off and landed, and deck operations were as efficient as an assembly line. The US was forced to withdraw 9,000 troops from Okinawa to reinforce Guam. This time, the Liaoning's voyage was further, faster, and more resolute. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces Tokonami-class destroyer and P-3C patrol aircraft shadowed the Chinese fleet throughout, but only managed to photograph the busy deck of the Liaoning. A J-15 fighter, after being launched from the Liaoning, could reach Guam's airspace in just 10 minutes. This time is even shorter than the emergency response time for US base aircraft in Guam. Currently, the direct distance between the Liaoning carrier group and Guam is approximately 1,500 kilometers. Within this range, US surface forces are almost non-existent. Guam, a critical node in the second island chain, appears particularly vulnerable as the Chinese carrier group approaches it at an unprecedented close distance. The growth rate and strength of China's Navy are making the US nervous. From being confined to operations within the first island chain, the PLO Navy has broken through it, and now has both the first and second island chains within its strike range. Simultaneously, of the US Pacific Fleet's 3 active aircraft carriers, one is entangled in the Middle East, another is being watched by the Chinese Navy and Air Force in the southwestern South China Sea, and the third has just left Japan and is not yet combat-ready. Never before has such a vast Chinese fleet appeared in these waters, is how the US Naval Institute News described this quietly torn maritime boundary. More ironically, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, after monitoring and tracking the fleet, was unable to continue shadowing it once it penetrated deeper into the Western Pacific. US media pessimistically stated that in the current absence of US aircraft carriers in the Asia-Pacific, the US military would be unable to quickly assemble a surface fleet east of Guam that could counter the current Liaoning carrier group. Therefore, Guam's door is wide open. This key air and naval base, the core of the US's second island chain and the linchpin of its island-hopping strategy, is unprecedentedly exposed to the formidable might of the PLA's carrier battle group. In response, a spokesperson for China's Ministry of National Defense stated that the Liaoning carrier group's training in relevant waters is not aimed at any specific country or target, and it complies with international law and practice. The Japanese side's actions were overreactions. In fact, experts explicitly state that carrier group sorties beyond the island chains have become a new normal for the Chinese Navy in recent years. The answer is simple. In the context of increasingly tense cross-strait relations, the PLA's naval and air forces are comprehensively exercising their capability to advance in wartime, establish sufficient safe zones and strategic depth for a landing operation on Taiwan, and simultaneously deter external forces from intervening. Establishing a secure corridor and strategic depth within the first and second island chains is a crucial strategic objective for anti-access, area denial operations. Once an operation begins in the future, the PLA's landing fleet will operate within the narrow Taiwan Strait. In such circumstances, without a significant deployment of pure naval and air forces beyond the island chains, the fleet within the narrow strait would face a high probability of a comprehensive strike from US naval and air forces coming from east of Taiwan. Therefore, the Liaoning carrier group's sortie to the deep waters near the Philippines and its approach to Guam for high-intensity, real combat training has become a new normal for the Chinese Navy to hone its far-sea operational capabilities. In recent months, the US and its allies have not shied away from concocting plots around China's periphery. For instance, during the Shangri-La dialogue, the defense ministers of the US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines held a meeting and subsequently issued a so-called joint statement expressing dissatisfaction with China's actions in the East and South China Seas. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated that while the US does not wish for military conflict with China, China is a threat that cannot be avoided. He therefore urged a series of US partners in the Asia-Pacific to emulate European allies by increasing their military spending to 5% of GDP. Furthermore, Austin grandiosely declared that if this were achieved, the US would not criticize its allies on so-called environmental issues in the future, and would attempt to impose its own ideology and policies on these nations. While this might seem like a good deal for Asia-Pacific nations, allowing them to largely discard US influence, the US media outlet The Washington Post believes that few countries would be willing to deepen security ties with the US while simultaneously being influenced by the US in trade. Moreover, the type of security ties the US desires are based on an anti-China stance, and China happens to be the largest trading partner for many of these regional countries. Some of these nations are even striving to overcome poverty, yet the US demands they incur greater defense expenditures, which is clearly unrealistic. These remarks were met with collective refutation from Southeast Asian countries. For example, Abdullah, a special advisor to the Malaysian Prime Minister, stated that raising military spending to 5% of GDP is utterly absurd. He emphasized that expanding economic cooperation with Southeast Asia would be a better choice for the US. Singapore's defense minister In Jiang Hen also stated that if Singapore were forced to choose a side, it would inevitably choose to support the global order, because only then would it avoid falling into the law of the jungle where the strong prey on the weak. The Chinese Navy's current deployment of a carrier battle group deep into the Pacific, approaching Guam, also serves as a warning to Western nations. Meanwhile, on the eve of Sino-US talks, the US delivered a slap in the face by reportedly opposing China's plans to build a new embassy in the UK. One might ask, what does China building an embassy in another country have to do with the US? This is a long story. In 2018, the Chinese government purchased the former Royal Mint site in London, planning to build its new embassy there. This piece of land, located in central London, near the Tower of London and Tower Bridge, holds significant strategic value. Once built, China would possess an enclave in the most prosperous part of the British capital, significantly boosting China's influence in Europe. However, this plan has been stalled for several years due to manipulation of public opinion by anti-China forces in the UK. In 2022, the Tower Hamlets Council in London refused to approve the construction of the new embassy. As China and the UK deepen their engagement, the situation has taken a turn. In January of this year, British media reported that the UK government might approve the construction of a new Chinese embassy in London, but with a series of conditions attached. The Times, in its latest report, also mentioned that less than 2 weeks after UK Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves' official visit to China earlier this year, the Metropolitan Police and Tower Hamlets Council dropped their objections to the project. According to US media reports, UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy and Home Secretary Yvette Cooper also expressed support for China's plan to build a new embassy in London in January. However, the Times reported that the embassy project has raised new security concerns because the Royal Mint site is close to the UK's financial centre, where 3 important data centres are located, serving as sensitive hubs for critical communication cables and are considered potentially vulnerable to attack. A senior US official claimed that the US is deeply concerned that China may have the opportunity to acquire sensitive communications information from one of our closest allies. It was reported that Donald Trump had previously urged UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer to reject the embassy construction. This issue was even brought up during trade negotiations. The UK is currently negotiating with the US on how to implement the trade agreement signed last month. The two countries must reach an agreement by July 9th to avoid British steel producers being hit by new 50% import tariffs. When asked about the impact of approving the new Chinese embassy on the US-UK trade agreement, White House officials seemed to issue a veiled threat, stating that the US hopes all decisions are made with our national security interests in mind and after full mitigation measures have been adopted as advised and approved by counterintelligence professionals. Diplomats stated that if the embassy is built, the Trump administration would be hesitant to share intelligence with the UK. Pulford of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China declared that the embassy has become a focal point of US-UK trade negotiations. To put it plainly, the Trump administration is using the US-UK relationship to strong-arm the Starmer government. On the surface, it's about getting the UK to reject China's new embassy. In reality, it's about forcing the UK to maintain distance from China and preventing the two sides from getting too close. On the eve of the Sino-US talks, the US issuing directives to the UK on the embassy construction is essentially a demonstration of power to China. Negotiating in the UK gives the US a psychological advantage. Previously, whether it was the Geneva talks or bilateral phone calls, it was always the US requesting things from China, leading to some voices within the US criticizing Trump for being soft on China. Now, Trump's decision on the eve of the talks aims to change this situation and give China a preemptive strike to gain the upper hand in negotiations. For Trump, the UK currently needs the US, especially on the tariff issue. The UK hopes the US will ease up and quickly reach a new bilateral trade agreement to help the UK extricate itself from its current economic predicament. However, benefits from the US are not easily obtained. The Starmer government, in addition to appeasing the US, is also committed to mending ties with China, attempting to walk a tightrope between the US and China. This is naturally intolerable for Trump. Therefore, the US is now giving the UK a choice. If it wants to gain US trust, then the UK must choose between the US and China, and not try to have it both ways. Otherwise, the US could halt trade negotiations with the UK at any time. Of course, this matter also reflects Europe's attitude. Although the UK has left the EU, its capital is closely intertwined with Europe. To some extent, Europe pushed the UK out to serve as a trailblazer. Due to close US-UK relations, if China is willing to improve relations with the UK, it is highly likely to also send friendly signals to other European countries and maintain an open attitude. Therefore, this should not merely be seen as an adjustment in the UK's diplomatic priorities, but rather as a significant shift in Europe's overall diplomatic stance towards China. Looking back at recent international developments, the America First 2.0 policy pursued by Trump after taking office has increasingly squeezed its allies. The US demanded that European countries increase military spending, purchase expensive American products, and imposed high tariffs on European exports to the US. These self-serving actions have caused dissatisfaction among European nations. The US's forceful attempt to acquire Greenland further sowed seeds of resentment in European countries. Although most countries chose silence at the time, cracks had already formed. Against this backdrop, the UK's shift in foreign policy towards China has made the US uneasy. The US has consistently pursued a national policy of uniting all allies to jointly contain China. The UK's move is undoubtedly a significant blow to this policy, but ironically, the catalyst for this series of changes is precisely the US's own selfish policies. The US has long acted solely on its own interests, disregarding the legitimate demands of its allies, ultimately leading to their disaffection. The UK's decision this time is a microcosm of changes in the international landscape. The US's long-standing hegemonic actions are gradually dismantling its painstakingly built Western alliance. In the future, with the completion of China's new embassy in London, China-UK relations, and even China-Europe relations are expected to usher in a new phase of development. All of this was once within America's grasp. America First has ultimately led to even its traditional allies turning away. That's all for today's program. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your clicks mean a lot to me. See you next time.